Will you go tab it again?
Tab, yeah.
We talking to it?
Test, test, regional. Test, test. Test, test.
I see. Are those on?
Testing. Test.
Okay.
Test. Test, test. work in a number of countries to advance the right of access to information. The Carter Center is a non-governmental organization led by former United States President Jimmy Carter. And I will be providing just some basics on both the programming but also the issue. And then we'll be hearing from these wonderful panelists. So I will introduce them to you now, and then you can hear again from them as they speak. So second over, we have Ms. Vandanarana. She, if you got the bio notes, is an expert on the UN CEDAW committee. She's been one of the members since 2016. And in March 2016, she was awarded the Woman of Distinction Award by the UN NGO Committee on the Status of Women, a recognition for her outstanding leadership, her profound commitment, and exceptional contribution towards the advancement of the status of women locally and globally. There's a lot more in here, but we would spend the whole 2 hours together going over all of the accomplishments of these women. To my immediate right is Ms. Dubravka Simonovic. I'm sure you all know her. She's the UN Special Rapporteur for Violence Against Women. And she was appointed in 2015 for her first initial 3 years. And there's a maximum tenure of 6. So she's got hopefully 3 more that will have just started. So we have quite a bit more time with her. And she, if you don't know her, is an amazing promoter of women's rights and protector of women as they unfortunately continue to suffer from violence throughout the world. Next to Ms. Rana is Minister Wulameda Saiditar. She is a Minister of Gender, Children, and Social Protection for the government of Liberia. She has been the minister for the last almost, a year and a half now, following the election of President Weah. But she has a long history of working on women's rights. She was the founding executive director of the Valley Peace Foundation of Africa, where she fundraised and coordinated worldwide scholarships for women and girls. And I've had the pleasure to work with her over the past year and a half, and she is a dynamo when it comes to working on women's issues. And finally, we have Alejandra Vargas Garcia. She's a senior program officer for the International Development Research Center, which is an arm of the government of Canada. She has 12 years of experience in international development, advocacy, and public policy work related to women's rights. And so we're so pleased to have her joining us as well to talk a bit more about both research and also what the government of Canada is doing, thank you, related to their feminist open government. So with that, and with your permission, I'd like to begin the session by telling you about Georgina Camara from Camara Town in Liberia. Camara Town is in Montserrado County. It's about an hour's drive away from the capital city of Monrovia. And Camara Town has a population of about 5,000 people, but it lacks sufficient latrines.
Can you talk more to the microphone?
Sure.
Sorry. Thank you.
Sorry. Oops. So Camara Town is outside Monrovia. Is this better, Jason? Okay. It has a population, as I said, of about 5,000 people, but it lacks sufficient latrines, wells for clean drinking water. But it was really the only place that Georgina Camara, her sisters, and her kids knew. It was their home. Unfortunately, her father, who owned all the land, had died, and with that, her dream of remaining on the 50 acres of family land. After her father's death, she and her sister were visited by their uncle and told that they had to move because as women, the land could not belong to them. Her uncle was taking over the land, her home, and the future that she had planned for her family. Well, this story is not unique. Women around the world suffer from discriminatory laws and patriarchal cultures that deprive them of equal rights and place them at constant risk. You are all in this room are very well aware of the status of women, but just quickly, as we know, 2/3 of the world's illiterate are women with less opportunity to go to school or continue an education past the 5th grade. Women continue to suffer from violence, with an estimated 35%, that's 1.2 billion women having experienced gender-based violence at least once in their lifetime. And women continue to be placed into forced marriage and childhood marriage. Every minute, 23 girls under the age of 18 are married. Women have more limited economic opportunities, and about 1 in 3 married women in the developing world has no control over the household spending. Yet interestingly, when a woman receives $1, guess how much she invests back in the family? You all know the answer to this, but when a woman gets $1, how much do you think she spends back on her family? she spends 90%. So 90% of every dollar that a woman receives goes back into the family. Now guess how much a man spends back on his family when he receives a dollar? Close, 30%. So this lack of control over household cash is true even though women are often the wage earners with the double burden of income generation and caring for their family. Notably, women make less for the same work that men do, and of course much of their work is unpaid and unnoticed. I'm not sure how many of you saw this, but recently there was a household calculator developed where you can put in all the time that you spend on childcare and on cooking and cleaning and taking care of the household and all the things that we don't get paid for, you can put in and it monetizes it. So I decided to try to do that as a single mom caring for my child. So I put in all the woman's work. And it, as I said, it monetizes it. And can you imagine if I got paid for everything I do to care for my house and family, how much I would make? I was very conservative in the hours I put in, but I would make, on average, $199,212 a year if I was paid for the woman's work that I do. Way more than I get paid as a director at the Carter Center. And women, particularly Indigenous, elderly, or unmarried women, often are the world's poorest, the least educated, and the least aware of their rights and opportunities. But we believe that access to information can change that. If women were able to access important information held by the government, such as information about educational opportunities, how to start a business, the local budget for building roads and schools, or their rights to health care, to own land, or to be free from violence, they really could use that information to change their lives. So we created a short video that demonstrates this much better than I can, and so with your permission, I'm going to try and show this.
Access to information is a universal right, but across the globe, women often have trouble exercising this right. Without proper documents, they are cut off from important services. Without meaningful information, they can't make their voices heard. Many women have no time to seek out information because they face the double burden of earning an income and caring for their families. Others don't get the information they need because they are not aware of their rights or live in cultures that discourage women from pursuing them. As a result, in some parts of the world, only half the population can fully access information and the benefits it provides. But what if that changed? Information has the power to transform the lives of women around the world, helping them to understand the full range of their rights and to participate in public life, empowering them to achieve economic success and to make better decisions for their families and futures, enabling them to hold government officials accountable and to bring about change in the areas that matter most to them. The Carter Center's Global Access to Information program is working in countries around the world to help make sure women get the information they need. Inform women, transform lives.
So the Carter Center began, thank you, we love that. So the Carter Center began programming related to the right of access to information in 1999, so about 20 years ago. But it wasn't until about 10 years ago that we realized that for all the work we were doing, women were largely not at the table. They weren't there trying to promote the right to information, they weren't making requests, and if it's a fundamental right, we wondered what's going on here. And really, we believe that women need information even more than men do, because as we know, elite men already have access to information. It's really women who don't, who are excluded from that. So I went to my boss, former United States President Jimmy Carter, and said, I really think that there's an inequity here in the right to information. And he said, very wisely, prove it. So we selected 3 countries. We went to Liberia, Guatemala, and Bangladesh to apply a study on whether women, in fact, were able to exercise this fundamental right with the same facility, which we defined as frequency, ease, and rate of success as men. We did a mixed method study, including interviews with community leaders, experts, and civil servants working in government agencies, as well as men and women seeking government services information. In total, in the 3 countries, we interviewed about 1,700 people, and we visited 128 public agencies 3 times each, because we wanted to make sure that we were capturing the realities. And we looked to see what happens when a woman comes in versus when a man comes in. And as you can see, our hypothesis was supported, the community leaders in these countries as well as the experts, with the majority of those interviewing saying that in fact it was their perception that women really were not able to exercise this fundamental, this universal right with the same ease, frequency, or rate of success as men. Perhaps not surprisingly, the only group that disagreed with this was the public agency employees themselves. And as you can see, the majority of them, as high as 90% in Guatemala, think that women can get information just as easily as men can do, that really there's no difference. But a few things to note. In all of these countries, the majority of the public agency employees, so those people we spoke to, were in fact men. And as one of the researchers was told by a man in Bangladesh, really we don't even have women working here, and if we do, they need to be backward facing. Only men can be forward facing to talk to people. And when our researchers went into the public agencies, those 128 agencies 3 times, what they saw in practice was really very different. They saw that when men came in, they were often attended to more quickly, they were provided the services or the information without question, whereas a woman was often ignored or derided, questioned why would she want information, what could she do with it anyway. And even the agencies themselves are not set up for women. Again, going back to Bangladesh, oftentimes the agencies themselves don't even have bathrooms for women, only bathrooms for men. And in Guatemala, and I know we've got some colleagues here from Guatemala, the law says that when an indigenous person comes in to the agency, they're supposed to be spoken to in their indigenous language. What we saw is when an indigenous man went in fact, he was spoken to in Quiche or Mam or whatever language they spoke. But when an indigenous woman came in, and she's often well recognized by her beautiful trajes, her beautiful clothing, she was only spoken to in Spanish, often the language that she herself did not speak. So while the study also interviewed these women and found that 90% of the women said that they wanted information, and they were incredibly articulate as to what kind of information they wanted, again, when we interviewed the men, they questioned whether women in fact did want information and what they would do with it. A second part of the survey then went beyond, or the study, beyond just are women able to access to what in fact are the obstacles if they can't. And pretty similar across all the countries, we saw illiteracy, lack of awareness of where to go and how to ask, fear of asking, no time. Women are busy with childcare and household and taking care of their husbands and fetching the water and subsistence farming to actually be able to get to the agencies, and also issues of access. So for many women, it's an incredibly perilous journey to leave their community to try to go into the city or the areas where the public agencies are. And then it's really just not considered culturally appropriate or some form of paternalism. In fact, again, in Guatemala, in order to leave the home, a study by UN Women found that 85% of the women have to ask permission from a man just to leave the home, much less to go into a public agency. And in Bangladesh, when we were talking to women, one of the mother-in-laws actually said, so it's not always just the men, you know, it's very culturally dependent. So one of the mother-in-laws said, oh no, my daughter-in-law should not be asking for information. That would embarrass our family. That would put our family at risk or embarrass my son. And so it's really a host of issues. And again, fear coming out very clearly across all 3 countries. The final part of the study asked, if you could overcome those obstacles, what information is most relevant to women for economic empowerment and the promotion and protection of rights? And across all 3 countries, the #1 answer was education. Women want information about education for their children, for scholarships, for how to make sure that their kids get the best education possible, how many teachers are supposed to be in the schools, even the hours of the schools and whether they're supposed to be paying a fee. After that, women wanted information on land rights and also starting a business and how to get their own ability to be economically empowered. And then finally, around issues of violence against women. So how do we change this paradigm? The Carter Center in our target countries started working, and that's Bangladesh, Guatemala, and Liberia. And we chose those 3 countries to demonstrate that this is not an issue to one country, to one region, to one hemisphere, to one continent. You know, it really is very similar. And people ask me all the time, what if we did this in the United States? And my response is, I think we would find similarly that there's an inequity. It may not be as extreme in some of these countries, but I believe that in all of our countries, there's still the tendency for women not to feel like they have a right to ask for information, to question the power authorities, which is what it looks like when you're trying to exercise this fundamental right. So we've worked closely with governments to try to raise awareness about the value of information for women and the obstacles they face. We've reached thousands of civil servants to try and build their capacity to provide meaningful information to women, but also to try to do some gender sensitization on them. As one of the key obstacles was women's ability to reach public agencies, we've worked with the government to see how can we get information into women's hands in the places that they congregate. So where is it safe for women to be, and how can we put the information there, whether that's marketplaces or outside of the schools. We've worked with those government agencies to go, a bit like bringing the mountain to Muhammad, so to speak. So really getting the information into the communities and into the hands of women. We've also focused on supporting women's groups to be more engaged and to assist women in seeking information. So we have local partner organizations that raise awareness about the right to information, and we've established information facilitators. So women armed only with training and a laptop who go into communities and go door to door oftentimes, or meet in the village courtyards to see what information women want, and then they serve as that liaison with the government agency. In Bangladesh, we've got a project in the slums of Dhaka where young women are going door to door and helping other women to seek information. And recently we met with these young women and said, you know, what has been the greatest experience in trying to help others get information? And what was so moving was one young, very young woman, probably just starting college, maybe high school still, said the greatest experience for her was now when she goes into a government agency, they call her madam, and they give her respect. So not only are we helping women get information, but we're really changing, in many ways, women's own confidence in themselves and ability. Over the course of the past few years, we've done training for over 8,000 women and facilitated more than 700 requests for information. So we help raise voices. On the left, you'll see a woman from Po River, again, outside Monrovia in Liberia. And after learning about her right to information, she rose up at a community meeting that I attended and said, quote, "I used to think that because I don't know my ABCs that I had no rights. Now I know that even if I can't read, I still have the right to ask questions. I still have the right to ask for information." And then the woman on the left is one who lives in the slums of Dhaka, who has helped with one of our information facilitators, our change makers, and she requested information about the canal in her community that had been completely clogged with dumped garbage and waste. So she submitted a request for information, and as has happened in most of those 700 requests, she never got the information. But what she got was the actual activity that she needed. She got the change that she was seeking. So in this case, she didn't get any information about the canal, but they came out and cleaned it up so that they now have a well-running canal in her community. So I think the biggest lesson that we've learned over the last years is as much as you can work with government and as much as you can work with civil society, if you don't change the enabling environment, if you don't do something to make it more conducive for women, and a lot of that is, I think, what these women have been doing to alleviate some of the fear and some of the, not just the legal barriers, but really the social and cultural. It's very hard to make this sustainable and to keep moving on. So we're working on that, trying to, again, identify champions and see what ways we can do to try and change that environment in which women live. And I think that's really going to be the struggle as we move forward with our programming on Inform Women, Transform Lives. Perhaps one more story before I turn it over to my colleagues on the value of access to information for women. So this woman here is Blanca Nieves, and for those of you who speak Spanish, you know that that means Snow White. And for nearly 3 years, 83-year-old Blanca didn't exist. She was living in the small town of San Jose La Arda in Guatemala, doing all the things that real people do, real living people, but as far as the government of Guatemala was concerned, she was a non-person. The official record book containing her information had been destroyed, so when the government changed its identification system, she didn't get a new ID. And like that, her identity and the small pension that she received vanished. Blanca Nieves suffers from dementia and can't live on her own. For the past years, her caretaker, her niece, has been helping her. And they had no idea how to go about getting her this new ID and the social workers they talked to couldn't help, and time passed and they made do. But then a president of a women's group near where her niece lived had come to an event around access to information and shared with her niece Reina that she could ask the government how to get this ID. So Reina made some requests for information on how to get her aunt back on the government rolls. She received some help from an information facilitator. Doesn't happen overnight, it took more than a year. But a year later, Blancaneva's official ID finally arrived. And 3 months after that, she began getting her pension again, which they now use to pay for her household needs. Last year, quickly, the Carter Center organized a conference. A number of these women were there, called Inform Women, Transform Lives. It was the first time that different groups came together, groups working on gender, on transparency and access to information, to start thinking about this issue. There were about 100 people from 30 countries, and outside is a copy of the recommendations coming out of that conference. It was facilitated by President Carter, and it includes such recommendations like making the right to information explicit in international and regional instruments, ensuring that access to information frameworks are gender sensitive, raising awareness, and mitigating the backlash and risks that women face. We're now working to promote the declaration, including President Carter having sent it to every head of government around the world and encouraging them to take concrete actions to promote and protect women's rights. Let me just end by going back to Georgina Camara from Camara Town. You remember her? In the very beginning, we were talking about her. Her uncle came and tried to take away all of her land. Well, shortly after, Georgina attended an information session that my colleagues organized about the Liberian Freedom of Information law, and she learned that women could ask about their rights and how to make information requests. She and her sister went to the mayor's office and asked about their rights to inherit land. They were told that, in fact, women could inherit, and as the daughters of the landowner, they were the rightful heirs. Georgina and her sister hired a lawyer to reclaim their land from her uncles and are now the proud owners of 50 acres of land, including the Pavlava hut, where the traditional gathering place for leaders to meet, to greet visitors, make decisions, and address conflicts. Today, Georgina is the head of the Camara Town Freedom of Information Club, where she shares the importance of access to information with others. And her sister is the first woman to oversee, to be on the area's administrative committee to oversee village lands. So the Carter Center is exploring advancing the Inform Women, Transform Lives campaign. We hope to work in the future in 10 inaugural countries, where we'll seek to galvanize national leadership and action to energize a global movement. So we very much look forward to working with all of you. And I'm going to now take a stop and turn to all of my colleagues. I wanted to just provide a bit of a background on the issue and why we're all here so passionate about it. And so with that, I'm going to, I think, turn to Bandana Rana to speak first a little bit about what the CDAW committee is doing, what CDAW says or doesn't say about women's right to information, and what might be some next steps to move the issue forward. Thank you, Bandana.
Thank you, Laura. Very good morning to everyone, and thank you for being here. This is an issue of great passion for me. I come from a media and information background, and working with the media, the activism grew in me because it's such a male-dominated profession. That's how my activism started. And I could, though Laura's asked me to talk about CDAW, I'm tempted to talk a little bit about my experience coming from a country, a small country, a developing country, Nepal, a very patriarchal society. I could relate to all the challenges and stories that she related so very well, and was happy to hear the transformative changes also, the positive changes that she said. I just want to share a story. You know, in 1992, it was 91, 92, the first Human Development Report of UNDP was being issued, and I got this assignment from UNDP to make a documentary encompassing human voices from the community, from the grassroots level, for this launch of this first Human Development Report of UNDP. So, I was a young media person, and I was working as a consultant for this UNDP FAO project, and so I got the opportunity to go to many grassroots communities and districts. And no one had actually given me any orientation. Gender was not an issue at that time, hadn't taken any class. So, and I grew up in a culture where women are supposed to be silent, seen but not heard. You know, that was the culture that I grew up in. So here I went with my sound man, my cameraman, and myself as the key director for this documentary, and I tried to get voices. And first, of course, the men were more accessible, they would talk, they were very comfortable in front of the camera, so it was easy to get their voices. And then I said, this is not right, I need to get some voices of the women, human voices. So I tried to approach the women. Every time I put my mic in front of a woman, there would be 3 men talking for her. You know, like, she doesn't know. You know, and the woman would be mum. She wouldn't speak at all. So it was so difficult for me to get the voices of the women in this documentary, and it just didn't feel right. I could have finished my work and gone and said I didn't, but it didn't feel right. So I wrote back to my bosses in the capital saying, my documentary is not coming well, I'm not getting the real human voices, so I need to extend my days longer to find out what's wrong. Of course, typical UNDP said, oh, your DSA was for 5 days, you know, that's your assignment and you need to come back. And I said, no, I will stay back on my own expenses, but I want to get the voices. So I stayed back. This is related to information. So I stayed back and I said, where do I get to hear these women? You know? So I did a little bit of research on my own and realized these women wake up early in the morning at 4 a.m. and walk 1 hour to fetch water. Water is a scarcity in Nepal. So that is where, so I got up early and I said, this is where I can meet the women. So I went to this, it's called Chautara, you know, like where all the women meet. There's a whole tap and, you know, meet. And then I heard the voices of the women who were so mum. They were singing, they were dancing, they were yelling, they were quarreling, they were shouting. But that's where the voices were. They were befriending themselves. So I befriended them and I wanted to know what are their concerns. So it took me a couple of days, I mean, not right away. But then I realized the violence they faced, you know, the domestic violence, the sexual abuse, the dowry-related violence. So all that came in, the battering, the physical battering, the emotional violence. And I think I actually took up my decision that time. I felt, I mean, I'm a Nepali woman. I have been through discrimination, which I didn't realize was discrimination when I grew up because it was part of culture and I thought that was it. But when I heard them, I felt myself to be very fortunate that at least I could speak to my parents, I had education, and being in the media, I was working for the national television, the government television, which was very new at that time, had just opened. So I had access to policymakers as a media person. So that's when I said, oh my God, I need to get the voices of these women to the policy table. So what I'm trying to say here is it is so difficult to get women's voices in the culture that she was talking about in Bangladesh. You know, this is so related to, and then we do not have institutionalized organizations who actually work on the right to information, and not just the right to information, creating that enabling environment to access information, to ask questions. So I was happy to hear about the Carter Center, it was last year I think, you know, with this particular theme. Because as a journalist, I had the opportunity to attend in 1994 after that, because I tried to find out now what, you know, what are the information-related issues regarding women. I got the opportunity that was pre-Beijing preparation, Women Empowering Communication in Bangkok. And as a journalist, I went there. But when I went there, all the women gathered there, I mean, they were all known women from all of Asia, gathered there, would talk about, oh, I belong to this women's organization, I belong to that women's organization, that network. And I had to introduce myself. These were, I think, 800 participants. I had to say that I belong to a media organization. And it was almost like I was an outcast. You know, like, you are not one of us. I felt a kind of a misfit. But the passion that you need to be institutionalized, you know, you cannot work alone as a media person for women's working in the media, drove me, and then I attended the Beijing conference also, so drove me to open an organization, a women's media forum. You know, so the need for institutionalizing, just working me alone in the media couldn't help. So that, what I'm trying to say here is, and again, I relate to all that you said, the culture. I personally, though I had good education, I personally was taught by my mother that you should not speak loudly, you should not ask questions, you know, you should be quiet, seen but not heard. If I laughed a little loudly, that's not the way you should be laughing. You are someone who needs to go to another person's house, get married, so you have to be very quiet and soft, not ask questions. That's the culture I grew up in. So this culture leads to, even if you have the best of information that the government is disseminating, if you are nurtured in a way that you cannot access those information, you cannot ask those information, it leads to so many things, the culture, the stigma. And then you start asking questions. Suppose if I'm a career person, I've joined a job, and the first day of the job, I ask a lot of questions about my rights, who's doing what. The perception of my colleagues would be, oh, she's just too much. It will be looked at negatively. But if the same thing a male person was to ask, they would say, oh, he's got leadership qualities. He seems very intelligent, very sharp. That's the kind of stigma that we are working about. All this leads to property issues now. Because if I don't have information, there are widows, single women, who have no information about how to access their right to property. So what happens, if their husband dies, it's their brothers, the brother-in-laws, and the other family take away so it's related to that. It's about transferring knowledge. How do you raise your children? If that is the way I'm raised, that's how I'm going to raise my daughters, So it's transferring knowledge to the younger generation. It's access to health services, particularly sexual and reproductive health information. You are taught to be shy. These are things you shouldn't talk about. So how do you approach a health assistant and ask these questions? So your health suffers. I mean, just number of issues that right to information is so related. So right to information is not just having right to information, but it is related to the vicious circle of other rights, violence against women and all other rights also. That's what I think, Now coming to CEDAW, because I feel CEDAW, here's a former CEDAW chair, who's been 3 terms, I think, in CEDAW. So she knows much more than I do. I'm just a new entry into the CEDAW, though I have been using CEDAW as one of the most powerful tools in my advocacy, because it's a legally binding, principally a legal framework that has an accountability mechanism which actually reviews the government's progress and gives recommendations in the form of concluding observations. So it has a mechanism that the governments need to respond to, and for the activists to look at the concluding observation and use it as a tool to strengthen advocacy. So I think it's one of the most strongest advocacy mechanism. And I was talking to Dubravka this morning, and she said, during a time, CEDAW was difficult. Over the years, CEDAW has been more visible and has worked even, the work has been even more instrumental. So I was very happy to hear that. Now let me come to right to information, because I attended the Carter conference last year, February, I think, right? And immediately after that, I went to the CEDAW session. We were working on the general recommendation on climate change, the gender dimensions of climate change, and disaster. And as we were reading the last draft, I came to that right to information was nowhere. And disaster, the right to information is so important. So I could manage to integrate not only right to access to information, but creating an enabling environment to access information during disaster time, in climate change. So gradually, we are trying to see how we can, we do a lot about access to information and right to information on health issues, sexual and reproductive health, So all that we have been integrating. So, however, we could do more. That's what I feel. We could do more where right to information is, particularly I come from that background, so I feel passionately about it, and I feel I could, as I was walking, I was thinking, what is it that we can do more, One, I think I've spoken to Laura earlier also. Even in the last session, we had a very good panel during the CEDAW session on women, peace and security with stakeholders. So one, I'm passionate enough, but in order to generate that passion in other CEDAW committee members, the Carter Center or Laura, you could think of having a panel during the CEDAW session on the right to information and linking it to all the 16 articles, and what are the kind of how you could make your constructive dialogue and your COBs more strong is one area. The second, we do not seem to, the CEDAW committee looks at alternative reports. It looks at state party reports, and it looks at alternative reports sent by NGOs, UN agencies, and other human rights, national human rights institutions. We do not seem to get any information So I think if you have partners in countries who are reporting to CEDAW, you should encourage those partners to send an information, alternative information about how it impacts all the articles, and then perhaps that would strengthen the dialogue itself. That's the other area. The third, and I don't know, Dubravka, what do you think about it? Because it is just a loud thought. This is what I'm thinking now. We have the National Human Rights Institutions delivering a statement before the dialogue. So, and in many countries we have national information commissions. So they are almost in par with the National Human Rights Commission, but they look at the information. You could also encourage the collaboration of national information commissions to send out statements on the right to information to the CEDAW committee prior to every constructive dialogue. I think that would also be very constructive. I mean, I would go for general recommendation. I know you said you have talked about general, we have talked a lot about general recommendation. And of course, it would be great to have a general recommendation on right to information because it is linked with all of the articles, and Dubravka is more of an expert here, and she will have her views, I'm sure, in regard to that, and in fact, advice also. However, we have some constraints in terms of resources, in terms of time, because general recommendation takes at least 2 years, and we have a number of general recommendations already in the pipeline. But I would encourage you to work and mobilize attention to this in collaboration with other interested stakeholders, could be UN agencies as well, stakeholders, to initiate the discussion on the need for a general recommendation on informing women, transforming lives. So I'll stop.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Those are great, concrete ideas. I'd like to now turn it to Dubravka Simonovic, who you've heard a lot about from both me and Vandana, to talk a bit more about the issue of how the cycle of violence impacts women's ability to have voice, and how silence and violence kind of fit together and undermine this idea of informing women and transforming lives.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel. Good morning to all. I would like to say that I'm here as UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, its causes and consequences, and that this mandate, as was mentioned by Laura, is an old mandate from the UN Commission on Human Rights, established 25 years ago. After that it was Human Rights Council, but now we are reaching a point at which it is important to see how all those mechanisms like CEDAW, like my mandate and other regional mandates are responding to challenges with respect to women's rights today and violence against women. At this session of the CSW that we are all participated in and listening many statements, we have to challenge ourselves. I am also looking at this mandate now, 25 years after its operation, and my next report is going to be thematic report on work of this mandate, challenges with respect to mandate and the future, because now I think that when we are going to look at 25 years after Beijing Platform for Action and what is there, and you know that in Beijing Platform for Action, violence against women was one of 12 areas of concern. But now, 25 years later, we are seeing around the world ongoing discrimination against women, ongoing different forms of violence against women. We are seeing women marches around the world, Me Too movement, other movements, New Namenos movement. Women are saying loudly, we want changes now, we want this gender equality now, we want elimination of discrimination against women and violence against women. They want information about their rights, they are challenging the system. And mechanisms like mine should do much more. So now I'm trying to see how to join forces with all other similar mechanisms, CEDAW committee and regional mechanisms that are already established to monitor different treaties like MESECVI that is monitoring Belém do Pará Convention, then also we have Maputo Protocol for African countries monitored by African Commission on Human Rights. How we can join forces, there is also Gravio at European level monitoring the Istanbul Convention. The main question is how we are joining forces to push back those pushbacks. And maybe you heard Secretary General saying in his statement that we need to push back movements. I have seen during work in CEDAW committee that was mentioned, and through this mandate that we need to focus more on implementation of all those nice instruments that we have. Now we do have also SDG commitment on achieving gender equality and empowering women, and elimination of discrimination and violence against women are main targets there. So now going back to Beijing. In Beijing, Platform for Action Violence Against Women was one of 12 areas of concern. Now I have proposed in my statement to the CSW that violence against women should be considered at each session of the CSW as a main target. Now we have to see that at each session of the CSW we have to look at discrimination against women, different forms of discrimination against women, and violence against women as targets that are considered each session in order to measure the progress. So I think that we have to see how to approach this new environment differently. And here we are coming back to Carter Center and this important initiative, Inform Women, Transform Lives, because information is a key. And with respect to work of my mandate on elimination of violence against women, I have possibility to travel to countries to put forward specific recommendations, but also to produce thematic reports. I have produced thematic report on online violence against women, and here in this area of information, we have to look at the role of new information technologies and digital space that is now extension of our lives, regular lives. So we are not even seeing how we are using human rights norms at these new digital platforms, and this is a challenge. So I think that with respect to right to information, it will be important to address digital divide. There is a situation in some developing countries that women do not have the same access to digital technologies as men, because this is part of ongoing structural discrimination and exclusion of women, what is a dominant situation in all countries all over the world. We cannot find a country in which there are no specific problems related to discrimination against women and girls and different forms of violence. So we have to be able to address also those new forms of online violence against women, targeted cyber attacks on women human rights defenders, on women in politics, on women that are more visible than others when they are seeking their rights, their human rights, including the right to information. But as was mentioned by Laura, we also have to look from the whole framework, how we are approaching the global world with respect to women's rights in general. And I hope that in the future we will have clear understanding that human rights that we are developing for all of us in order to have same set of rights for all individuals around the world as established in CEDAW Convention, Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women and Regional Treaties, that all those rights should be observed by states and also by digital platforms, and we are not yet there. So mechanisms like mine, this rapporteurship on violence against women, is focusing on responsibility of states to uphold women's rights. And the same is with CEDAW and other regional mechanisms, because we are now focusing on obligation of states to provide information that is needed, to provide access to human rights, to eliminate different forms of discrimination against women and violence against women. And this state responsibility to do it, it's not yet there. We have seen many dignitaries during the session of the CSW coming to attend the CSW with statements related to situation in their countries. But we have to see how they will change realities with respect to ongoing forms of violence and discrimination in their countries. And I hope that in the future we will be able to use those mechanisms that are here, like CEDAW committee, my mandate, and other independent mandates, to push back those pushbacks to implementation of already adopted human rights instruments and treaties that are protecting women's rights and girls' rights in different parts of the world, but that are not really implemented. And this is a huge challenge. So coming back to right to information and the whole platform presented here by Laura and Carter Center, I would like to support this initiative very much, because this initiative is basically connecting women's human rights with realities in different countries. And we have to see how through access to information we are challenging those ongoing forms of discrimination and violence against women. How women could be informed in different environments that they do have right, be it for land, be it for protection by social service or access to justice, if it is related to other rights. Shelters are extremely important in different countries, protection orders, collection of data is extremely important, and now I'm also very much focusing on collection of data, because if we are trying to see progress, now we are having data that is clearly showing that not only 1/3 of women around the world are victims of different forms of violence against women, it is almost every second, or maybe each woman is a victim of some form of discrimination and violence. Because now when women are speaking up, you are seeing that it is really pervasive, that it is happening everywhere around the world, that those movements like Me Too are revealing that it is much higher than we are able to measure through prevalent studies on violence against women. I am also trying to encourage countries to collect data on gender-related killings of women, because this is administrative data, objective data on intimate partner killings. And through this type of killings, we are seeing that even in Western European countries, such killings are ongoing. And they're in a context of intimate partner killings. If you look at 10 persons killed, 8 of them are women. So those are gender-related killings that should be prevented. And how to prevent it? Through different forms of prevention measures that should be established in each state. Through access to information, women should be able to use those rights that are there. And many times, as was mentioned by my colleague from CEDAW and Laura, they do not have full information about their rights. So we are speaking about women's rights as human rights, but they are not able to use those rights if they do not have information about their rights and how to use those rights. So I think that this initiative is really going in the direction of connection between all other rights that should be exercised through this transformative idea that access to information is opening possibility to women and girls to use their rights in a proper manner. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm now going to turn it to Minister Tar, from Minister of Gender from Liberia, to talk about some of the realities at the national level and some ideas perhaps for what can be done to advance women's rights to information at a national level.
Okay. Thank you so much. I want to appreciate the Carter Center for having this. For us, we are really concerned about pushing this because we realize that just generally as a country, and like was mentioned here, but just growing up in a country where women were relegated to the kitchen or relegated to the home, and were not used to speaking out in public, not used to being in meetings, and having serious discussions, we realize that it is very powerful when a woman gets the information she needs and she's properly informed and can go out there to advocate for herself, advocate for her community, and just generally fight for issues that are concerning women. As it regards our own country, we know that some of the issues facing women in our country, just for example, just participation in leadership. We have issues of harmful traditional practices. We have women who, of course, do not have economic power, because most of the time men are the ones with the economic power, and that affects everything. But there are ways in which we know that we can communicate. There are ways in which we know we can access information in order to prop ourselves up. One of the other hurdles will be just the level of illiteracy amongst women in Liberia. And so just being able to have, like the story you told, a lot of women who are illiterate feel that they're stuck and they have no means of getting out of the circles that they're in. But with access to information, a whole new world opens up in terms of them understanding their own power, in terms of them understanding that, for example, just a market woman, for example, knowing that she have access to go to a Ministry of Commerce to understand market prices, to know how she can sell her own wares, to know where she can go and access consumers, and all of that is very important for their livelihood. The other thing that's very important, and that we're happy that we've been able to establish hubs in the different counties, is just being able to go to those hubs and get information around their rights. Like we just passed the Land Rights Act, you know, going back to the story about the 50 acres of land that was taken by from the sisters when their father died. So now women have the right to own land, but information dissemination is important, because if there are a lot of women who remain silent, there are a lot of women. My mother was very educated, and I remember when my father died, her brother-in-law came and said that, of course, and it gets worse because they'll say they even own you as the woman, you know, and you are passed on. And so she had to fight that. She had to fight that to be able to have ownership of the work that she did with her husband. Even myself, coming up as I grew older and became an adult, one of my uncles totally challenged me from my parents' home. And I had to tell him that I'll fight him all the way. We'll take it to court, and that the same blood that flows in his veins flowed in mine, and it was a serious challenge. So just having the access to information is important, because I think it's powerful. It empowers women. It empowers women to be able to go out there and fight for the right, fight for themselves. I also want to point out that when we talk about this, there's a divide. So you have the older generation that maybe struggle a whole lot, and then you have this younger generation now that have all of this information coming to them. But then how do we tailor it to our own communities? And how do we encourage that the gender gap is closed, and that the young women are able to help the older women? We want to be sure that every woman understands that the right to information is fundamental. When women can access information, they're able to do a lot. And one of the things we're going to be working on is how the younger women can work with the older women, especially people who might not be as lettered as themselves, to be able to access information, to know where they can go depending on whatever issues they are facing in life, to be able to access health. I tell people go to the hospitals. The other day, one of my directors fell ill. He had a stroke, and he went to the hospital, and his wife came in, and she said, well, the doctors are giving him medication. I'm like, do you know what kind of medication they're giving him? He said, oh, they said we shouldn't bother them, they're doing their work. I'm like, no, it is your right to ask for the kind of medication, to be sure they're giving the right kind of medication. Also to know about side effects and all of that. And then her daughter was there, she was online. I'm like, you should help your mom. What you can do, when they give you the information, go into Google, drop it in Google, and you'll be able. She's like, for real? I'm like, yeah. So sometimes we even have the information right in our hands, but we don't know how to access it. So that was a teachable moment for me, that this younger girl, even though she had the information, but did not know how to access it. So later on, we even found out that it was the wrong medication that he was getting. And I mean, sorry to say, but our healthcare system is not the best in Liberia, so we do have these kind of challenges. But I think just being able to know how to go about getting the information, and to know how to go about leveraging for yourself helps a lot. And it helps a lot in people being able to make better decisions for themselves too. And we want to be sure that the government can use the county service centers to be able to improve lives and open up doors for access to information, but also want to be sure that from the government and that we are training people to be able to go out into the communities and help community donors take advantage of the work that you're doing at the Carter Center, and make sure that women are having access to information.
Thank you so much. Thank you for those reflections, Minister Tar. Lastly, I'd like to turn to Alejandra to talk a bit about what the Canadian government's doing and why, as well as its impacts, if any, and the work that IDRC is doing to follow that, monitor, and research.
Perfect. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Perfect, thank you. That's a tough act to follow, the challenge of being the fourth and last, but I'll do my utmost. So as Laura mentioned, I work for Canada's International Development Research Centre. I thought to kind of give you some grounding about some of the work that we're doing. I'd just spend a few minutes explaining for people that might not be familiar with our work, what it is that we do. So IDRC is part of the umbrella of the Canadian kind of government's foreign assistance package, in the sense that our mandate is very specific to the generation of research. So our goal is basically to engage with particularly young researchers in developing countries that actually have a very clear identification of some of the key challenges, but really may require some support, both obviously from a financial standpoint, but mainly from a technical standpoint, to understand how to make sure that that evidence has sufficient rigor so that it can inform kind of policies, and there isn't that argument challenging the validity of the data. So that's kind of one component of our work, to really support the generation of evidence and boost it, but also to support individual leaders and their capacity to participate in spaces like this and share some of the results, but also to kind of advocate for that kind of public policy entry. I think a big challenge that is relevant to this debate about information is not just the generation of information itself, but what are the right avenues and pathways to make sure that it reaches the office of who it needs to reach, and it gets reviewed in a format that's accessible and that actually allows the information to be used as intended. And I think in that regard, as someone who works both in the intersection of research and public policy, that's an area where I think all of us can learn a lot, and spaces like this, particularly with civil society organizations, are key to try to identify what are better ways to service that demand for evidence and to do it collaboratively in a time where I think the very fabric of democratic kind of institutions is being challenged. I think examples from Me Too highlighting how institutions and governance systems are failing us really highlight that this is a moment where we don't only need to kind of outline those values, but really do a very effective job of showcasing with actions how to do it, and access to information is key to that piece of the puzzle. I wanted to share some of the examples from our work to kind of grant discussion, because I think an important piece of it is not only kind of providing access to women to women of information, but also to recognize that women themselves are important and vital sources of information that need to be tapped. So it's not kind of unidirectional, it's really kind of, it goes in both ways. And I think it's important to highlight that, to make sure that in the kind of building of public policies, we recognize that from a either paternalistic, neither instrumentalist kind of approach to what do we do with access to information. So one thing that I wanted to say is, for example, some of our work that IDRC has been doing in Kenya, and this is a great example from the Muturi settlements. We do a lot of work in informal settlements on land right issues. And one of the things that really kind of struck me when visiting Mukuru in particular is that it's really the community of women. So when you go in, you obviously kind of talk to the chief to get access to the informal settlement, which is on the outskirts of Nairobi. And it's really the community of women there that are running the show in impressive ways. So everything from developing a grid system for housing. If you can imagine a picture of some of the kind of slums where really the infrastructure for understanding, which areas need X, Y service, it's really hard to do. And the women in the Muturi settlement are doing a grid system that allows houses to be marked with like A52C. So they have an entire kind of system to really understand if water fails, which sector did it fail in, right? If there's a land right dispute, the women are the ones that are negotiating those dynamics. So that information lies squarely in these women that are often untapped from national service and from spaces where my husband would remember what I was wearing this morning. He's more likely than I am to be asked critical informations about the well-being of what we do. So that's kind of one area where we're seeing that the power of women is particularly interesting and relevant. The other one had to do, and this was a panel that I participated in yesterday, IDRC has been doing a lot of support to CRVS systems, so child registration and vital statistics. And I think a key piece to the puzzle is recognizing this invisibility of women to begin with. If you're not kind of registered, that's the end of the game in terms of not having legal identity, which then follows into your access to every other kind of service. So I think a key area of action would be how do we strengthen the CRBS systems throughout to make sure that there's that comparable information, but also in terms of who holds information and recognizing the value of women. One of the things that Myra Vivenich from Data2X was highlighting is that it is the women that actually know in the communities who was born, who died, right? And again, it's an entire untapped source of information about asking the women how do they contribute in that data generation. So just to kind of highlight the dual nature of information to women, but also by women. And then another example that I wanted to highlight was the Mahila Samakia program, which was a program in India supported by the government. And this was all based on collective action. And the idea behind that is that women would be provided with X amount of information in community, and as a collective, they would decide how to use that for provision of services. So should lighting be done in X community, should investments go to that school? And yet one of the challenges with the program was that it was particularly hard from a government's perspective to understand the impact, because people were doing different things in different communities, responding to local realities, but it was very hard to extrapolate from a government perspective how they were kind of explaining that story of impact. And yet it was these women who had very clear understanding about which services were needed. And I think a lot of the work that the government of Canada was doing through IDRC, but also kind of liaising that relationship with the government of India, was understanding that impact on women's empowerment can be measured in many, many ways and important, and recognizing that connection directly from women, access of information and service at the local level matters, and that's impact too. And we need to give an overall rethinking of our definitions of what we mean by women's empowerment and the indicators that we choose to measure that. So I wanted to highlight some of those examples a little bit, just to say that what this highlights is that women are the ones that have first direct information, and yet they're the ones that are being the least kind of consulted. This puzzles me for two reasons. As a feminist, it puzzles me because it's 2019. It makes you wonder, when is it our time? From an efficiency perspective, it puzzles me because it's just such a wasted opportunity to really get information in real time from people who not only access those services way more. Women access public transportation at rates that far exceed that of men. Educational attainment for women is higher, right? In Latin America, it's women that are accessing schools at higher rate than men. And this is not intended as a negative comment to the gentlemen in the room. We thank you for your presence and we appreciate it. But just to say that it's women that are accessing public services and that we're not being kind of consulted around the processes of how those services could work better. So just to say something to tackle there. And I think this is validated by Laura, your research from the Character Center, that was saying that when it actually came to defining kind of national action plans by governments, it was less than 30% of women that were actually participating in that process, which really tells you something about what the end results might be from that perspective. So why is this happening? I was asked to comment a bit on this, and then kind of what are some of the implications from a research standpoint. I was listening to your comments about being shy and being told when you were little not to speak. I think the impact of social norms cannot be understated. There's important research, and this holds true both in developing countries, but just here in the US, that when women are accessing information in schools or they get asked questions, there is that kind of 7-second delay that happens in raising your hands to answer the question, right? So I think there just needs to be that kind of realization from a public policy perspective, from an educational perspective, that gap is there from a social norm standpoint, and really build programs that recognize that and address that, so teachers wait a bit and then say, I'm gonna call on the last or the second person that raised their hands. So there's that element of social norms, which I think is very important to tackle and particularly hard to do. And we're doing it from an IDRC perspective regarding gender-based violence, and it's incredibly long investments. So something to highlight about the importance of government like us to really invest in this thing financially and technically for the long haul. And the other one was around the care economy. A lot of the work that we have done on even counting women's work, recognizing some of the contributions that women are doing in the care economy, which are 2 to 4 times that of men, highlight that time is a precious resource, and as the Carter Center highlighted, it's particularly hard to go and access information in a setting where there is no time to do so, but also on your work to get there, you might be exposed to sexual harassment, and then when you reach the government office that's supposed to give you information, you will neither be taken seriously and perhaps kind of harassed and abused along the way. So these are kind of some of the gaps to address from that perspective. I wanted to highlight one concrete example of what are the implications of this, because I think at the macro level, everyone kind of understands what the reports are saying. The Global Gender Gap Report, data from the World Economic Forum, is telling us that closing the global gender gap is going to take 100 years, 75 years in some components. We're also kind of participation of women in parliaments. I think everyone's familiar with the fact that we haven't kind of increased that gap past the 30%. Latin America, for example, is 29. That is information that oscillates on the macro level, and I think it's very important to highlight as to what are some of the implications from that lack of consulting and access to information for women. But on a grounded level, I kind of wanted to highlight one good example that points to why open governments, which will be the next part of my statements, matter. So one of the projects that IDRC has been doing for a long time was in Pakistan, where there was an enormous intention from the government of Punjab to actually provide skills training programs for women. So they were created, they were launched, a huge significant investment of money, and then women weren't kind of showing up. And that got perversely understood as the fact that women perhaps didn't have interest in skills training. I'm not going to address perhaps if the areas of focus on skills training were the right ones, but women weren't showing to the table. And that was because there wasn't a gender lens to understanding that the mobility challenge in Pakistan was humongous. So everything from negotiating with family members or spouses, even exiting the house to begin with to go to the training was a challenge. The violence that could ensue from going to the training and failing to address the care of kind of children, but also just validated and not validated from research in some sectors around some of the challenges that women were facing along the way. There's a great documentary piece that IDRC did that I'm happy to send you the link around, where men were being interviewed about mobility challenges in Pakistan. And it was coming from a genuine perspective for the most part of saying, it's just the world is too dangerous. For my daughter, the world is too dangerous for women. And kind of breaking some of those myths and practice with information when it was even the men that weren't necessarily going out there into the communities where the trainings were offered. So there's kind of the information challenge not only affects the first immediate person that doesn't get it, but it translates into everyone else in the community that's operating under information that might not be correct or validated. So one of the efforts that we did with IDRC was then how to work with the government of Punjab to bring that gender lens, to provide information about how many women in the community existed, what were kind of interests and areas, and how to provide routes of kind of transportation that recognize that mobility challenge and address it. So those are kind of some of the implications in terms of public policy where good intention might not be met with results due to that kind of critical information gap. So what do we do? I'm going to highlight a couple of examples from the government of Canada that kind of reference some of the work that we have been doing at a macro level to try to address both how to have an open government, how to have a feminist government altogether. One was the Feminist International Assistance Policy. So starting in 2016, the government of Canada did a series on consultations with civil society organizations, with social movements, with members of government, with organizations like us that are kind of on the outskirts of the foreign policy area, but doing critical work on research to try to understand how to insert a feminist lens into kind of development assistance. This is probably the most ambitious kind of commitment from the government of Canada to bring that feminist lens. And I say this with a disclaimer that I'm Mexican, so I'm a Mexican living in Canada, so I am not advocating for the Canadians just because no one will deport me, but just to say that I have a critical lens as someone who comes from countries where we're trained to be very critical of government. But it was a heavily ambitious kind of commitment to try to address how to have a feminist lens in our development assistance. And what that came with concretely was a commitment to kind of enhance the protection of human rights of women, which basically meant a lot of heavy investments, both financially and technically, in GBV protection, and giving funding to civil society organizations at rates that were importantly and heavy and important. The second was around increasing their participation and particularly trying to address the very challenging aspect of how to meaningfully engage men and boys into the picture and tackle kind of toxic masculinities. And the third one was around providing women with more equitable access and control over resources, which is a pretty kind of straightforward one. And I'll name some of the specifics. So the commitments from the Government of Canada is between 2021 and 2022. Obviously, no less than 95% of Canada's bilateral international development assistance was going to target or integrate a gender equality lens, and that now 15% of all bilateral international development assistance had to implement initiatives that were dedicated exclusively to that advancement of women. In terms of the impact of that, I think organizations like IDRC are kind of well placed to do that process over time and really try to unpack how do those investments materialize directly in results for women. But from a human rights angle, I mean, they should be there first and foremost, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you as well what might be some of the good indicators to make sure that those investments are well captured in terms of impact. The other one, I'll be quick, was around open government. So basically how to democratize or make government more accessible to everyone, not just kind of women, to make sure that there was a process of co-creation as opposed to a process that was kind of coming from a top to bottom kind of perspective. And for that, since 2012, Canada has been quite active in the Open Government Partnership, which basically offers both an advocacy and an action platform where both are kind of really trying to give back power to citizens. And in 2018, Canada became the chair of the OGP for a year, and with that came some very specific kind of commitments about how to engage gender lens into a perspective of open government and to capture some of the lessons on how to do that. So the goal from that is that by the end of 2019, at least 30% of all the members of the OGP, which is a huge cutting across initiative to bring kind of governments and civil society together, which I think is the right way to go, would have a gender commitment. One concrete example from Canada that I should highlight is that we are hosting the OGP Global Summit in May 29th to 31st. I look forward to seeing many of you there, where 1,750 civil society organizations, academics, and governments are coming together. Yet one area to highlight from the open government that hasn't quite been addressed is that very few commitments have actually had to date a specific lens on gender. It's only 2%. So that's really an area where we need to boost that a little bit better. And that's where IDRC, the Government of Canada, and other partners came in, and I'll leave that last.
Actually, Alejandra, we may have screwed up and we may only have till 10 o'clock.
Okay.
Although we thought we had till 10:30, so we definitely want to give at least a few minutes for comments or questions.
For sure. Then let me just close with this. I'm happy to answer any questions on feminist open government, which is really kind of try to think how to bring a gender lens on what we might go to insert a feminist lens into that. Happy to give you some examples from the government of Argentina and other places where this is done well, and to really share some of the data.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Great. Sarah, will you take this? And unfortunately, it sounds like we only have about 5 minutes. I'm so sorry.
Good morning. I hope I'm allowed to talk here as a man. Am I allowed to talk? Am I safe? My name is Sonny Monidafe from Nigeria, FCT Secondary Education Board. I want to just ask a question and then an advice maybe. The topic is about informing women and transform lives. About 23 years ago, 2 years after Beijing conference, I did a master's degree program in University of Lagos. And the question that my professor asked, which he said he asks every MPA student class, that's Masters in Public Admin, is that if there is public admin in Nigeria, the point being that you don't take what writers in Europe, America write, and want to transform, impose it on Nigeria. You have to look at the peculiarities. So I want to ask if something has been done about reappraisal of the Beijing conference. It took place about 25 years ago, and women were informed What about the men? Now, I love my wife, I love my daughter, 35 years of marriage. But the truth is that, yes, in Nigeria, for example, we have situations where many of the guys, of the boys, don't go to school. Now, in trying to balance the gender equality, more girls in schools. Today, 25 years after Beijing, we have more girls, first degree, second degree, PhDs in Nigeria, in their thousands. We don't have commensurate men to marry them. Now, if such a girl marries a young man, there'll be violence in the house because he will feel inferior. Now, the lady from Liberia spoke. Liberia, Sierra Leone, men have been killed by the wars that took place. In Nigeria, the Boko Haram threat has cost the lives of many men. Now we have more women educated. They are informed, but nobody to marry. The few that they marry, because of their lack of enough education, feel inferior, and they attack the women. So in doing that, I want to advise that maybe a reappraisal so that we can look at how to balance it across the world. The lady from Liberia talked about equality in politics, for example. You don't give political positions. You have to fight for it. You don't give. In America, in Canada, the women are all over the place. The last ratio of women in America was quite high. They competed for positions. Not so in our country. So you have to find a way to balance it, to give the women enough chance to school. But right now, the men are seriously underrated, seriously not in the right places.
Okay, thank you
Thank
so
you very
much.
much.
We'll just take a couple quick comments, and then we're going to end in the next 2 minutes. 2 minutes.
Thank you very much for convening this discussion. And my brother from Nigeria, thank you so much for your comments. But in your comment lies the underlying mindset change that we need. There's a lot that you said that was really, really difficult to digest. What makes me fulfilled as a woman is not if I am married. That's the fundamental truth. We should all understand that companionship is a mutual decision between two people. And if I am educated and I have a PhD and all the degrees, and that intimidates my companion, then they are not value for me. So I understand what you're saying, that there's an observation that a lot of women are educated and are not married. I think we need to look at the other dimension in sensitizing men to be less, to feel less of men when they are with women who are educated or have achieved a little bit more than them. So that's one. And then when it comes to fighting for politics, I believe that at this level, the parity has been so unequal for centuries. I think there are movies where when women were fighting for the right to vote, there are times where women who were protesting were arrested by police officers, and the police officers told their colleagues, send them home, their husbands will deal with them. So if we are speaking about the right for women to be given the opportunity to have political office, it's because the mindset gap is there, and also the disparity has been there for so many centuries. It's just almost like affirmative action. So it's something that is well deserved. But I really hope that when we have engagements like this, we could have more men here so that we can have this mutual. It was a lot of us who were in the elevator. And one of the security officers who was manning the elevator, we couldn't find our way, so we're going back and forth. And we got on one of the floors and one of his colleagues asked him, "Oh, so what's going on here?" He goes, "With us in the elevator." "Ah, you know what it is. It's Women's Week." What was that about? There are throwaway comments like this that are said, and it goes from those throwaway comments to places like a woman having well achieved and wanting to be able to aspire to the highest executive office, and she's not able to. They won't say it's because she's a woman, but that is the underlying factor. And that's the part of the equation that I don't know how we're going to get to it. Because as we finish these discussions, some of our own educated colleagues who are men have thrown away these comments, and we have to deal with it. It's very easy to discuss women who are in uneducated areas, and it's very easy to have those discussions. But women like you and I, who are also advocates, we have to deal with this every day. I am breastfeeding. I have a 10-month-old at home, and I've been traveling for work. There are times where I am walking in an airport looking for a place so I can pump to conserve milk for my baby. I've had to go to airport lounges and have to find a way to convince people that it's a necessity that I'm able to pump. But we have areas for smoking cigarette. We have smoking designated areas. The gender lens is very, very serious. It's really serious. And sometimes before we just have throwaway comments like, "Oh, you know, this women thing, this women," no. It's really important to live the reality of what it means to be a woman, what it means to have to be on the go, but you can't find a place to even go and change your tampon or your pad. It gets to the basic of that. When you are a woman who needs to be empowered, a woman needs at least $1 or $2 a month in order to be able to afford for her menstrual hygiene. That's how deep it is. It's on several levels. So thank you for coming, and convince your colleagues and others to come.
I'm so sorry. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Thank you so much for both of the comments. I apologize. We were told that we had till 10:30, but unfortunately, it seems that another group is going to be coming in. But we'll be here for a few minutes to talk to anybody who's interested. I really encourage you to share what you've learned here today and think more about the value of information for women and how we as a community, men and women, can start to create a more enabling environment and support women to access that critical information to transform her lives. So thank you so much to all of the speakers. What a privilege to be on this panel with these 4 women. This is why CSW is so important, because it gives us this opportunity to share our own experiences and how that translates into policy change. So thank you all for coming out early, and we look forward to talking to you some more in the back. Thank you.